How's it going, everybody? Marvel Cross 316 back with another comic book flashback. Today we are looking at the Amazing Spider-Man issue number 96. This issue came out in May of 1971, and today, folks, we're going to be looking at the return of the Green Goblin here. We also got an awesome issue here as well because this is pretty unique here because the Comics Code of Authority is not on the front cover here. You know, usually you would see like a Comics Code of Authority right over here, but the comic code was not added to this because this issue also touches on drug related issues, as we'll soon find out. And so that is pretty unique here. And so we have a lot going on in this issue. So let's go ahead now and continue with this series. The title of this series is And Now the Goblin. We got drama, we have action, shock. This one's a knockout. And I have to say, it truly is a knockout, as you'll soon find out. So remember from last ish, we saw Peter Parker in London, where he had gone to find the girl he loves, basically Gwen Stacy. But before he could meet Gwen Stacy, he had to become Spider-Man and go into battle, as we saw from last issues. He took down these terrorists. And so what's going to happen now as Peter Parker is returning back to the States here? This issue is brought to you by Stan Lee, who wrote this issue. We have Gil Kane and John Romita Sr. on the artwork, and then the lettering page by Artie Simek here. So let's go ahead now and get started with the issue here. We see the plane is flying back to New York. Peter Parker dwelling on what he had done in last issue, and we see here that he wasn't able to meet Gwen because Gwen and everybody else in London found out that Spider-Man was on the scene, and Peter Parker was afraid that if he met Gwen in person, she would put two and two together. And so Peter Parker's main mission was to go and search for Gwen Stacy in London, but instead he would only come back to New York with some great photos, as that was his mission as well. Because we recall how Joe Robertson basically paid for the plane fare, allowed Peter Parker to go to England, and Peter Parker basically promised Joe Robertson that he would get some photos so that he can pay Joe Robertson back for the free ride to London. So we see here that Peter Parker has a few extra bucks in his pocket, so he gets a taxi and he's going to go to the Daily Bugle, and we see that Joe Robertson starts to look at these photos, and he's really gazing at them for a long time, and Peter Parker is like, uh-oh, is he suspecting something that I hope he's not suspecting, which is basically, does Joe Robertson think that I'm Spider-Man? But we see here that Joe Robertson then looks up and says, okay, Peter, these pics are well worth what we spent for your fare. And he says, I knew you wouldn't let me down, son. So we see that Peter Parker is going to lead the Daily Bugle. Happy now. The next day we see he's at good old ESU at his college. He runs into his pal, Harry Osbourne, who is also his roommate. And we see here that Harry Osbourne tells Peter Parker that there's going to be this Broadway musical, and Mary Jane is going to have be a big part of this, as she has this big role, and he wants Peter Parker to come by and see this Broadway musical with him. But we see Peter Parker's like, I can't make it, I don't have any money. And he said, oh, come on now, you know, I could pay for you, don't worry about it, because you've been helping me with my studies. A tutor would have cost twice as much. And so Peter Parker's not going to go out without Harry Osborn basically saying, no, you are going to go. And then he also says, look, my dad's job offer is still open, and you'd be a jerk not to take it, so I'm just going to tell him that you're going to take it. And so Peter Parker's like, okay, whatever. And so the biggest concern for Peter Parker at this moment is that he doesn't want Norman Osborn to return back to his normal state. Remember, way back in issue number 40, Spider-Man had fought the Green Goblin, and in that fight, Spider-Man was able to knock out the Green Goblin and cause Norman Osborn to have amnesia, as we recall way back in issue number 40. Peter Parker's main concern in this issue is that he hopes that Norman Osborn does not regain his memory. Because if he will regain his memory, then Norman Osborn will be the biggest threat to Spider-Man's life. Why is that? Because the Green Goblin knows the secret identity of Spider-Man. But Spider-Man also knows the secret identity of Norman Osborn, as we recall way back in issue number 40. So that is Peter Parker's main concern. He starts to think about it and he's like, you know what? Why not? I mean, I have a natural talent for science. I think I need to go ahead and just use it. I mean, well, if I was good enough to win a science scholarship, why not make it pay off? And so Peter Parker goes by Osborne Industries. He goes up to the receptionist's desk, and the receptionist basically says to him that Norman Osborn is not here at the moment. He'll be right back. So Peter Parker is waiting in Norman Osborn's office, and he overhears a conversation going on with Norman Osborn and his doctor. And the doctor is basically saying, look, Norman, you need to stay away from crime business or just hearing business about superheroes and Spider-Man, all these reports about Spider-Man. It makes your blood pressure go up. And so we see that the doctor is leaving, and he says, remember, Norman, no more excitement. And so we see here that Norman Osborn is happy to see Peter Parker because his son, Harry, told him about how Peter Parker wants a job. And so we see here that Norman Osborn is happy to give Peter Parker the job. He knows that Peter Parker is also in college, so Peter Parker would have to work part-time. And he says, look, get back with me about your schedule, and we'll figure out those details later. And so we see here that Norman Osborn also says, it's strange, you always seem to remind me of someone, but I don't know who. Oh well, it's probably my imagination. So, it looks like Norman Osborn again his memory might be returning here. He said, "Hey, are you going to that Broadway to see Mary Jane?" And Peter's like, "Oh, I'm afraid I can't make it, sir." And Norman Osborn says, "Nonsense, Peter. It's on me. I'm treating the whole crowd, so you better be there, boy." And so we see Peter Parker has no choice but to go see Mary Jane. And so we see that as Peter Parker is walking down the street to go to this Broadway, he overhears a bunch of cops and everybody. But first off, he sees Aunt May and Anna Watson. They look like they're out to just have a good time here. They're not going to go to the Broadway, but they're going to see some other show called Hair, and it's not rated G. And we see Aunt May is basically saying she's trying to be hip and then also a slinger, and she has no idea what she's trying to say. She's, again, bless her heart, an old lady just trying to get with the times. So we see here that Peter Parker, again, hears all this commotion as this car is just screeching to a big halt here. It's a police car. Peter Parker races to change to Spider-Man here to check on what's going on, and he notices that there's this guy right here, and I mean, he is stoned right out of his mind. Basically, he's on drugs. This is where the drugs part comes in right here. See, this guy is on drugs. He says, I'm free as an eagle, and I can do anything I want. But he also says, I feel bad. And so we see that he falls off the roof of this building. Spider-Man catches him just in time here and returns him to the police. Even though Spider-Man at this time is still wanted by the police, we see mouth-to-mouth resuscitation takes place. The guy comes back to consciousness here, and Spider-Man is like, well, looks like my duty here is ended. And so he swings off, and the cops are like, isn't he wanted? So, well, I'd turn my badge for what he has done anytime. And so we see here that Spider-Man changes back to Peter Parker here, and now he's going to meet up with his friends Harry Osborn and Mary Jane. Harry's glad to see Peter Parker here, and he's like, "Man, I'm so glad you took my dad's or took the job, Peter, that my dad offered." Mary Jane especially is happy to see Peter Parker, as she's like, "Wow, you're no longer puny Parker. My goodness." And so she's very flirty with Peter Parker. Harry Osborn definitely doesn't like that. We see that they're waiting on Randy Robertson here. Randy arrives here, and he gets in this conversation about how, man, did you see what happened with that guy who was stoned out on drugs? I mean, it's just not fair. Us black people get the bad rap here. And he gets in a big argument with Norman Osborn. He's like, look, you're always in your ivory tower counting your bread when you could be doing something about this drug problem. And he's like, look, I'm just one man. It's not my responsibility. And so Randy says, you're rich. You got influence. That makes it your responsibility. And so they get into this big argument. Harry Osborn breaks up the argument here, and he's like, Dad, you cannot get excited, remember. So we see that they're going to finally go inside to watch the show here. Mary Jane puts on one heck of a show, as we see here. But after the first act, we see that we're basically at the interlude, and Norman Osborn comes across this room here, this locked door, and he starts to get the chills. Excuse me. And also, basically, like he starts to sweat really badly. And so something is going on. Something is behind that locked door that Norman Osborn desperately wants to know. So for the rest of the show, Norman Osborn is still in a shocked and like anxious mood here, and he keeps looking at that room, that locked room. Peter Parker, every time he passes by that locked room, his spider sense goes off. And so we see that the show finally ends. Mary Jane's so happy that they were able to come, and she knows that she's definitely getting recognized here for her act. We see that Harry Osborn wants to take out Mary Jane and says, hey, we need to celebrate. And he doesn't even invite Peter at this point because she's been flirting with Peter Parker all night. So we see that Norman Osborn, after the Broadway, is now going to figure out exactly what is behind that door. He has to find out. His memory seems to be returning here. Peter Parker races back up top to change to Spider-Man, and he's just in time to see Norman Osborn walk back into that Broadway. And so we see that Spider-Man knocks open the door here, and it looks like Norman Osborn has beat Spider-Man to the punch here, as Norman Osborn has opened up that locked door. And he's like, oh no, I'm too late. It was always rumored he had hideouts where he could change identities, but I didn't think it would happen so fast. And lo and behold, we see the return of the Green Goblin, and look at the first thing he says. Parker, you dare come here. Well, I can promise you this, you'll never leave alive. And that's how we end this big issue. What's going to happen up next in issue number 97, as we see Spider-Man and the Green Goblin fight it out right here in this great series. What's going to happen here? Is the Green Goblin going to reveal the secret identity of Spider-Man? We're going to find all this out as we look at issue number 97. So go ahead, give this video a like, comment down below what you liked about this issue, and subscribe. And I will see y'all in the next one.